Welcome, Joe. Thank you so much for coming to our Leadership Speaker Series. An honor to have Deloitte here. Thank you very much. Let me kick it off by saying, we've noticed that there's a deficit of trust in society with institutions. Yet, maybe the deficit is the smallest with respect to businesses who are increasingly looked to solve some of society's problems. How do you view the role of business in society? What are the responsibilities that a good business has? I know you've thought about that a lot in your role as CEO of Deloitte.
Well, first, Dean Beardsley, thank you. It's an honor to be here for all of us at Deloitte. This partnership with Darden and the broader UVA community means a tremendous amount to us, and I was telling you that we have over 1,000 alums from the University of Virginia across the various programs in our practice, and so this means everything to us. There's probably no topic that I've spent more time addressing over the past few years than the one you just raised around the role of business in society. And it's no secret that today trust is at a deficit, and trust is lacking in so many of the traditional societal institutions that people depend upon. And that was probably exacerbated by the pandemic and the role that the business community played in helping lead society through that extraordinary event, in keeping the economy running, keeping people employed, at the core of much of the innovation that took place to ultimately lead to breakthrough discoveries that helped chart a path out. And if you think about it, it's a miracle, the timeline on which we were able to develop an effective vaccine, many, many years shorter than the shortest timeline on record, really driven by private sector innovation, leveraging technology. That's another topic I'm sure we'll get into. And so as a result, you've actually seen trust in business hold up reasonably well. Now, when one asks, what is the purpose of business? There have been different views over time, but for the last generation, let's just say the early 70s through a few years ago, the general consensus was that the primary role of business is to drive profit maximization. In fact, the Business Roundtable, which is a group that aggregates leading companies and has the sitting leaders of those organizations meet from time to time, it actually had a statement on corporate purpose that said exactly that: maximize profits for shareholders. And a few years back, even before the pandemic, the Roundtable took it upon itself to take a step back and ask the question, is that really a long-term sustainable proposition when business itself receives its license to operate from society? If society is not bought in that this is working for communities, business is going to lose its license to operate. And so the BRT revamped that definition. And as it currently reads, it is that business is responsible for taking good care of a broad cross-section of stakeholders: communities, customers, employees, vendors. And the belief is that if one does a good job meeting the needs of that broad cross-section of stakeholders, that over the long term, fair returns to shareholders will follow. But the returns to shareholders, driving premium earnings, it has to be an outgrowth, an outcome of actually serving the needs of a broad cross-section of constituents. And this is a really positive development, and clearly there's some skepticism, there's some debate from both sides of the political spectrum relative to whether business is living up to that and whether it's even a good idea to set out as an objective, but that is really at the core ethos of today's business community. And I think it goes directly back to that question you raised around the role of business in a society where there's such a need to be able to look to trusted institutions in an environment where many other institutions have lost that trust.
Yeah. That whole stakeholder theory is an area that Darden's done a lot of work. Professor Ed Freeman was the founder of stakeholder theory, and we were happy to see it involved in the Business Roundtable. And maybe not surprisingly, at Darden, we have a lot of students and a lot of our own stakeholders that are keenly attuned to this question of how do you respond to different stakeholder interests. So I'm curious, at Deloitte, how do you decide which societal issues to comment on? Political issues, social issues. Increasingly, a large number of people feel that we should be commenting on everything. So how do you think about that as a leader in today's world when you also got to do your job?
There is no shortage of views on this issue. There are some very vocal constituencies who believe that businesses should be commenting on everything. There are some very vocal constituencies that believe businesses should be commenting on nothing. This comes back to values. You all are amongst the very best and brightest, and you have options in terms of where you want to deploy your talents. And so it is up to business to demonstrate that a particular employer is the place that you want to devote your energy. And increasingly, we see our people, or those who are considering coming to work for Deloitte, want to ensure that their efforts are going to drive positive outcomes for communities, that there's purpose in that work. And part of demonstrating that alignment is being willing to speak up for our values. And so on so many of these topics that are front and center in society, there is a real demand for companies to be willing to share a perspective. Now, you asked, well, how do you decide which ones you share a perspective on, which ones you don't, what exactly you say? There's nothing I take more seriously in the position of trust that I've been granted than deciding on where to deploy the Deloitte name. This is one of the world's most valuable brands. And so we have a framework that we've developed that tries to take each issue through some intellectual rigor in terms of its nexus to the firm and its nexus to our values, so that it's not just my own personal point of view coming through, it's the organization's best interests coming through. And I have zero doubt that it's critical to our long-term success to ground our operation in being purpose-driven, in being willing to speak out. Now, that does not mean that businesses somehow become the arbiter of all the most divisive issues that split society in today's environment, in many cases 50-50. And so inevitably, when we do speak out in line with our values, there will be some who think we haven't gone far enough. Why didn't you get more specific? Why didn't you come out with a position on this particular piece of legislation? There are others who will suggest that we've gone too far and that even any statement, even values-based, is implicitly suggesting somehow taking political sides, which is not the objective, because if business becomes viewed as partisan, if business becomes viewed as wading into every divisive topic, that statistic you shared at the front end around business being the most trusted constituency, which actually holds true across the political spectrum, will erode, and we'll lose the very platform that we today enjoy, which gives us the ability to drive such a broad-based impact. But this is complicated, and one person's values is another person's taking a political stance. I suspect if we went through a bunch of case studies, which I understand your curriculum has no shortage of, that we'd get a bunch of different answers in this room on different fact patterns. But it's something that we do very, very thoughtfully and with a lot of pride when we do choose to use our voice.
Thank you for sharing that difficult terrain. One of the social issues that I know a lot of students care about, and a lot of corporations as well, is the whole area of ESG, sustainability, climate change. Tell me a little bit about how you're thinking about that space and how Deloitte is approaching it.
There's a couple dimensions to this. So this is probably the defining issue of this generation. is the imperative around climate change driving towards a decarbonized society. This is a massive transformation where the level of intensity has ratcheted up, in my view, in a positive way over the past 24 months, but that is still a long-term journey that certainly won't move fast enough for the desire of some. There is the dimension of what do we, Deloitte, do to contribute to a lower carbon footprint? And we've made some very definitive commitments relative to net zero. Now, some of those commitments were really dependent upon the biggest source of emissions of a professional services firm like ours come from air travel. We had this event occur within the past couple of years that cut down travel to some extent. And so that's actually been an accelerant. And now we're sort of debating how do you keep the benefit from a carbon footprint standpoint of less travel, but still enable enough for our great people to be able to come together when it matters and build those kinds of relationships as colleagues and with clients. And we could get into probably a whole nother hour on that topic of how one balances hybrid work. So there's the Deloitte role in this. Then there is the role we play in helping clients through this. This is a rapidly growing part of our practice, driving decarbonization agendas, helping clients construct their own transformation journey and connect all the different dimensions of a very complex issue, which is something that an organization like ours, being the largest professional services firm in the world, with such a breadth of capabilities that all need to be brought to bear to successfully construct and execute that agenda, is uniquely positioned to do. Now, all of that said, you get into debates, going back to your last question around where we use our voice and where businesses wade into politics. Why do you serve this type of company? What is your view on fossil fuels? Clearly, there is an imperative to architect a transition toward a decarbonized economy. It's critical for our planet. There is also the practical reality that trying to flip a switch overnight would plunge hundreds of millions of the world's most vulnerable people into catastrophic circumstances. And so we bring a balance to this. We're trying to be part of the solution. We're trying to help the evolution. But different people will have different points of view around timelines and targets and so forth. And that's the beauty of being able to express different points of view, have dialogue, take different perspectives into account. And frankly, we are pretty pleased with the amount of consensus that we see across the business community, and really driving this is an imperative in a very tangible way.
Thank you. On the topic of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I know you've been a champion of that. Curious if you could share some thoughts about how you think about it and how you measure impact with respect to that topic.
The beauty of this topic is that there is an alignment between purpose and business outcomes. This is unquestionably the right thing to do, to drive a diverse, equitable, inclusive society. In fact, it's incredibly important to our people. They want to work in an environment that embraces DEI. It's also an absolute business imperative in an environment like ours, where the primary value we deliver comes through exceptional people, and we're living in a world where demand for what we do is growing exponentially. The talent pool, we've talked about this, is constrained, and frankly, the biggest constraint on our growth over the past year has simply been being able to access enough great talent with the right skill sets. And so anything that enables us to tap into broader talent pools and to make people wildly successful on the Deloitte platform, well, that's core to the entirety of our strategy across the firm. So this obviously sort of burst into the public visibility, the tragic events, the murder of George Floyd. You saw a lot of companies come out and make strong statements. A few of us looked at this and said, the words are the easy part. Anybody can just put out a statement and sort of make promises about how it's going to be different in the future. What are you actually going to do about it? And how do you sustain it when it's not on the front page of the newspaper? So we took a really significant step back and did some fundamental root cause analysis. Like what are the underlying barriers to equity? What are the reasons that progress hasn't been greater? And we made the decision that we were going to be ultra transparent. There was some debate. Some people said, well, if you actually put all this out there, you could be critiqued, or people could see just how far the gap is from where it really should be as a fully inclusive society. And we said, if we just keep sort of painting a pretty picture of the issue, nothing's going to change. You can always, by aggregating a whole bunch of statistics, sort of paper over the areas where there's an acute issue. We put it all out there in a highly disaggregated format. So if you look at our first annual DEI transparency report back in 2021, we cut the data at a greater level of granularity than just about any of our peers. And we said, this isn't okay, but here's what we're doing about it. And here are the very specific goals that we're setting that we're going to hold ourselves accountable for, starting with me, and building that into the way in which I'm evaluated, then cascading down across the broader firm. Maybe one of my proudest moments was when we published the second annual Deloitte DEI transparency report this past summer, because the progress was frankly greater than anything we could have possibly imagined relative to a timeline of a little over a year. Now, there's an age-old challenge between, when you made a lot of progress, but you're still nowhere near where you want to be, how much do you celebrate? Because you don't want people hanging mission accomplished posters. But you have to tap into that pride of, if you set your mind to something, your people see that you're actually accomplishing extraordinary results, while at the same time sustaining the intensity of the burning platform that there is still so much more to do.
Thank you. Let's turn our attention for a few minutes to the economy and the outlook and what you're seeing out there. First of all, you got a new report coming out, I think, with Fortune magazine examining trends in business. What are you seeing out there in terms of the economy? What's your view on a potential recession, or are we already in one? How are you seeing the economy?
You mentioned we have been doing every 3 or 4 months a joint Deloitte Fortune CEO survey to track sentiments. And this most recent iteration that we just did in the past several weeks, I'd say it's relatively downbeat around CEOs' views that the economy will deteriorate in the coming months. Yet there are some nuggets of optimism. Many of those same CEOs don't believe that their own company will be as significantly impacted as the broader economy. And seriously, there's a lesson coming out of COVID here, where so much has been thrown at leaders, and generally speaking, many have navigated with such success that there's this attitude of like, bring it on. What else could it be after all that I've dealt with for the past several years? There is also a groundswell of, I'm not going to let the short-term business cycle disrupt critical core investments in transformation. And we're certainly seeing that in the strength of our own business and our own pipeline, that companies realize embracing technology, digitizing the way they do business, migrating to the cloud, leveraging analytics, better engaging virtually with customers and employees. Those things are so core to their success over the next 10 plus years. And let's keep in perspective, business cycles aren't a new thing. You can go back hundreds of years and the economy has bursts, and then it has a downward cycle, sometimes tripping into the technical definition of a recession, which whether or not we hit one over the next 12 to 18 months, there are things that suggest we will, things that suggest we won't. No one has a crystal ball, but there will be some slowing. The point being, even if we do hit one, you come out and you want to be investing through the cycle so you come out stronger. And so we see an overwhelming theme of companies, particularly in a tight talent market, where notwithstanding the sort of storm clouds out there from a macroeconomic perspective, we have a 3.5% unemployment rate, the lowest level in 50 years. Companies are actually not behaving the same as they traditionally have when a recession looked to be on the horizon. There's even this term that's gaining traction over the past month of hoarding talent. Fascinating. Wanting to make the investments into both people and technology to ensure that they're well positioned for what still looks to be, through a medium to long-term lens, a lot of positive signals.
Thank you. You mentioned a number of technology trends. I'm curious as to which technology trends you see affecting professional services, and just more in general, if you think about all your clients, what are the one or two technologies you've got your eye on that you think are going to make the biggest difference on society in the years to come?
We're in the midst of adoption of a transformative set of technologies that's changing the way people live their lives, that's changing the way that companies run their organizations. It's changing the way that governments serve their citizens. And that's actually a big part of our practice, is helping governments transform. And it's not any one of these individually, it's the convergence of all of them, and we're still in the really early stages. So you have massive migration of compute loads from on-premises to the cloud. That allows you to access and store large volumes of data, the same data that actually feeds these ever more sophisticated artificial intelligence and machine learning platforms. Then you have the rollout of high-speed communications, 5G, connecting devices at the edge. Collectively, these things are revolutionizing the way that business is being conducted. So from a client standpoint, it's driving a massive increase in demand for what we do. And in terms of the impact on a firm like ours, on Deloitte itself, there's a massive transformation journey in terms of leveraging the capabilities of these tools. Now, people sometimes ask, well, is this automating away work? Is this destroying jobs? Is this displacing people? Over the past, you can pick your time frame, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. There's been a lot of study of this and prognostications, with many suggesting that we're on the tipping point of a huge overabundance of human labor, because these tools are becoming so sophisticated and moving up the value chain into the white collar that it's going to destroy large cross sections of work. There will be significant unemployment. What does society do? Do we put in place a universal basic income? In the face of those predictions and prognostications, where do we find ourselves today? 3.5% unemployment, lowest rate in a half a century, the most critical governor of growth being enough talent, not too much talent. There's a lot to learn in that. And I continue to be incredibly bullish that this isn't about whether technology does things better or people do things better. There's stuff that technology does way better than people, and there's stuff that people do way better than technology for a long horizon off into the future. There's one of my favorite quotes, Picasso. Computers are useless. All they give you is the answer. There's a lot in there. The ability of humans to relate disparate contexts, interdisciplinary thinking, understanding the dimensions of relationships and nuance. These are things that computers are terrible at. And the reality is that these technologies are simply making us as people, all of you as professionals, that much more powerful to have an even greater impact in what you do.
Joe, you took over as CEO not too long before COVID came around, and then we had this unprecedented pandemic that we all had to deal with. I'm just curious, from your perspective, what lessons learned were there for you? What do you think are things that will stay? What are the takeaways, if you will, besides the miracle of vaccines and medicines? But what are the takeaways for business now that you reflect back a little bit? Now that we're out of COVID completely, but what have you learned so far?
You're seeing a really significant change in what leadership means. And this is not something that was new to COVID, but I think COVID accelerated it. And in my view, it's extremely positive. When you think of, somebody asks, well, what's your stereotype of a CEO? People would often revert back to like a 1960s era mindset. There is an all-powerful, domineering leader sitting at a headquarters, in a palatial office, issuing edicts and specific instructions. And that's been chipped away over time as the economy transitions from, one that is heavily industrial centric to much of the economy being information centric and needing to sort of empower professionals with values. Not every decision can come back through corporate. There's not just one right checklist for the way you do every piece of work. Well, then COVID hit. And there was this unprecedented situation overnight that hit the need to be highly agile, the need to be highly empathetic. People wanted to feel a sense of connection with their leaders, that they understood the trauma and the real challenges that they and their families were going through. They wanted to see an alignment of values with many of the social issues that came to the fore. And so when you look at today and on into the future, those who are succeeding, those who are coming into and being selected for leadership roles, highly empathetic, highly values-based. We actually redid our own leadership framework within Deloitte. And the number one attribute across every aspect of leadership that we put at the pillar of that framework, a learning mindset. A learning mindset. That those who are sure that they have got it all figured out and have all the answers, that's not a recipe for success in today's world. Those who have some humility and recognize that this is a rapidly transforming world and that every day your job is to listen to a whole bunch of different viewpoints and get smarter. And yes, there's going to be some people out there who have different viewpoints from your own. They may even be viewpoints that you really dislike. Especially seek out those viewpoints. Especially seek out those viewpoints. I have a client, actually a very successful business person, that has this saying, that I refuse to allow myself to take a position on an issue until I understand the other side's argument better than they do. Like, that's the world that we're in, an ability to deal with a rapid pace of change, to be agile and adjust to circumstances that are changing daily, where things are going to come at you next week that you couldn't have even guessed this week, to assimilate a large volume of information and make sense of it for your people in a dynamic world that is stressful and is taking a toll on many professionals. That's what we're seeing as a leadership dynamic that I believe will carry forward well past whether we're in COVID or out of COVID, well on into the future.
I love that point on lifelong learning. That resonates a lot. If we think about our class here at Darden, let's say around 40% are global or international students. And I'm just curious what advice you would have in a global economy for those students looking to the future.
I think there's such a benefit to having a familiarity with different parts of the world and being able to operate in a global economy. And let's just sort of put the elephant in the room. We've been in let's say a post-World War II trajectory of globalization that some today are questioning, given the polarized geopolitics. Is globalization going to go backwards? There will no doubt be some geopolitical tensions and some difficult situations and maybe some decoupling of certain supply chains. But the general trajectory toward a business world that conducts business on a globalized basis is irreversible. The benefits are so powerful, and by and large, people want to live in an environment where they are able to access the full benefits of being a global citizen. And so I am incredibly bullish relative to the continued need to have a global mindset, to participate in a globalized economy. And there's no substitute for actually having had the life experience of spending meaningful time on the ground, embedded in society and local culture. And this goes back to the point about diversity through a bunch of lenses, including ideology, including culturally, and understanding different people's ways of life and gaining a tolerance. Incredibly valuable, and I don't think anything on the trajectory will change that.
So the class of 23 and 24 are all thinking about their careers in different ways. And then even when they graduate, as you and I both know, your career evolves over time. What is Deloitte looking for? What advice would you have on questions like, should I specialize and be narrow, or should I be broad? What advice do you have for people that are thinking about their careers, both right now, like I want to get a job right now, to what about the next 5 to 10 years, and what are you looking for and seeing at Deloitte?
So you asked, should you specialize and be narrow? You asked, should you be broad? And my answer is a resounding yes. So I am a big believer that it's important to be great at something, that you pick a specialty, you pick a profession, and you hone your skills. You develop the deep expertise. You become known as a leading expert. If you're in our profession of professional services, that is one of the mechanisms through which you become really valued in the marketplace. At the same time, we live in an incredibly complex and interconnected world. And so much of the breakthrough value comes from being able to relate concepts across different capabilities. Interdisciplinary thinking, being curious about a lot of different things and having the light bulb go off as to how they connect. So there's this debate that's taken place. Malcolm Gladwell put out a book 10, 15 years ago where he talked about how the real ticket to success in life is develop a deep expertise in one area. And this 10,000 hour rule, that you got to practice something for 10,000 hours. And people sort of gravitated to that. And there's a lot of logic in that. There's a lot of merit in the fact that one needs to devote a lot of repetition to hone their craft. But more recently, there's sort of been an expansion of that thinking. There's a great book that I've been out as a significant proponent of the past couple of years called Range. And the subtitle is Why Generalists Are Thriving in a Specialized World. And you know who wrote the endorsement for Range was Malcolm Gladwell. That the author of Range said, Gladwell's right, but that only gets you so far. So if all you want to do is be a deep expert in a very mechanical domain that's subject to predictable rules, if you want to be the best chess player, then you should just focus on that. But if you want to operate in today's society, if you want to operate in an environment where there's so much change and so much innovation, you better get really curious about all the other things out there that may not be the one thing that you focused on. And there's story after story of breakthroughs coming from people who weren't even in the field. Like, how is it that Einstein, as a patent clerk, solved the mystery of the universe where others who spent their whole life in a scientific laboratory didn't? How is it that the Wright brothers were able to solve the mystery of flight when all the deep expert aeronautical engineers who existed for centuries before had been studying it and had not cracked the code? Because those who come at things through a different lens, who aren't caught up in there's this one narrow way of thinking, but take a different mindset, are the ones who ultimately create breakthrough value. And so if one wants to create breakthrough value, it's essential to pair that ability to connect different concepts along with being really excellent at the thing that you choose as your particular craft.
Well, being CEO of an amazing company like Deloitte is very demanding, and I just want to take this time to thank you for sharing your insights with us today.